As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
A vast, sprawling network of intercontinental activity on a highly diversified scale that controls the lives of millions of people in the most widely separated parts of the world, manipulating whole industries and exploiting the labor and riches of nations for the greedy satisfaction of a few. That is the definition of imperialism by Kwame Nkrumah. And today, joined with me, I have the anti-imperial queen, Yara. How are you and welcome to the Malcolm Effect?
Thank you. I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm great. So all things imperialism, again, people, as I mentioned before, I've actually been blessed to come across paths with so many like deep thinkers, and Yara on Clubhouse was shutting it down in all the rooms that I was in. And I'm like, listen, if I'm benefiting like this, the rest of the world is to benefit like this. So thanks for coming on. Straight into it. When we say imperialism, what do you understand from that and how do you come to explain what that means?
Well, first of all, thank you for that great introduction. I'm glad that my addiction to Clubhouse is allowing me to connect with new folks and hear all these great perspectives. Yeah, so I think imperialism is one of the most sort of misunderstood processes. So many people sort of brush it off or understand it as being kind of like foreign policy. Like if a country has foreign policy, therefore it's imperialist. And so I'm really grounded in Lenin's understanding of imperialism as the highest expression of capitalism's demand for or need for new markets, right? And so it's this product of capitalism's inability to stay stagnant and capitalism's requirement for never-ending growth. And I think that Lenin's also the 5 stages of imperialism that he offers, right, which begin at monopoly capital, moving to finance capital, and then the exporting abroad of finance capital, particularly in the global south, and the 4th step being the formation of what he calls the Internationalist Monopolist Capitalist Association, right, which ultimately is like the division of the world among imperialists. I mean, all of these things are so crucial in understanding, what is imperialism? Who is imperialist, right? We see that word thrown around. I mean, I heard the other day someone say something like, well, what about Cuban imperialism? And I'm like, well,
Wow.
that doesn't make sense, because you need like a working definition for imperialism, and you need to understand the economy of a specific place before you can call it an imperialist nation.
Absolutely. And I think when we understand capitalist accumulation and we understand the workings and technologies of colonialism, we just find that imperialism today is just a manifestation of that. And we understand that capitalism being pervasive in the way it is, it needs to continuously expand. It needs to find cheaper markets, it needs to find cheaper labor in order to keep its system going on. So I think when we understand that, it's like this is why I find Nkrumah so important of a thinker, because I think I'm yet to find, maybe you can correct me, a thinker that detailed the workings of imperialism on the continent as great as Nkrumah. I'm yet to find someone. He literally understood it and explained how it works. Explained, for example, he said, even when we talk about like global working solidarity, but he noted that the kind of upward social mobility of the, let's say, working classes or middle classes. And again, I'm not trying to overstate that point, but there's the kind of welfare reforms that were begrudgingly granted to the working classes in the imperialist countries on the imperial core was a result of the expanding markets. It was the buying of raw materials at a cheap labor at a controlled price by the IMF, by the World Bank, manufactured in the West and then sold back to Africa. And that accumulation allowed for the West to develop, or to allow like, let's say, for the NHS in the UK, for example, or other concessions that were made in terms of welfare. Do you agree with my assessment on that, or do you want to correct me? Do you want to come back on that?
No, I completely agree, right? And I think that's why, anti-imperialism is so important because, we really need to we need to understand when we say something like, for example, one of the wealthiest nations on the planet, right? Like oftentimes
Yeah,
you hear folks on the left say, well, America's one of the wealthiest nations on the planet and it can't afford to give its citizens healthcare, right? And like that's a true statement, but we need to even go one step further. Why is
hmm
America the wealthiest country on the planet? What has
hmm
allowed the United States to amass the wealth that it has? And the goal should not be, the redistribution of America's wealth only to American citizens, right? Which would be sort of like this intersectional, progressive imperialism of some sort, which I
Yep,
think some SOCDEMs in particular look to the Nordic model and that's what they want. But rather our goal should be the like complete, redistribution globally, right? And I think Huey
exactly.
Newton says this best when he says, like, the fight, as our fight as internationalists is to return the wealth that America has robbed to the whole world, right? And so, and yeah, Nkrumah's piece, especially, like I think his analysis on neocolonialism is so important because what it offers us is it shatters this illusion that we're living in like a post-colonial world where
Yep.
these nations have now full autonomy, right? And he says clearly, like, there's this illusion that you have these independent states, but really their entire economic and political systems are directed completely from outside, oftentimes from the former colonial, the former colonial country, but not always, right? So sometimes you have
hmm
the passing along. So something that was previously sort of called somewhere that was previously colonized by France may now
hmm
be run by American imperialists, right? So I think
Yep.
Nkrumah's analysis is really important.
Absolutely. And I've been quite dismayed. Actually, the room we were in the other day when I came in and then I eventually kind of spoke and you were speaking before me. I think it was to do with Cuba. I was quite dismayed. And the reason why I even came to that room was I think the analysis or the kind of, not even analysis to be honest, not even analysis, it's not even vibes, it's just bad vibes and callousness of the assessment of imperialism by, I'm going to say this, I'm going to shoot my kind of point it towards you people in America by the leftists of imperialism has been quite disappointing. Have you noticed that as well? It's almost as if they don't, I don't know what it is about being within the empire or they don't know the US is an empire. I don't know, but those who quote unquote people who would say they're on the left have such a callous attitude to imperialism. Is that something you've noticed as well? Or am I just looking from outward perspective, as in looking
No.
in?
Yeah, no, and I mean I've noticed it too. Like, I mean, here in Canada, we have a similar attitude, and a lot of my comrades are like in the US and sort of in the belly of the
hmm
beast, right? And so I've been like watching this sort of situation with Cuba unfold for the last couple of weeks. And I think I feel a lot of the frustrations that you feel in hearing kind of this pseudo left or even sometimes like this actual left
Yep.
make all these demands for like nuance, right? I mean, I've come to hate the word nuance so much
Yep.
in the last month, right? And I think like I have a couple of thoughts on where I feel like some of that stems. And so, I think first of all, like what I mentioned earlier is like there's a huge element, and particularly in the United States, who their only interaction with something that they understand as progressive politics is sort of this rise in like this social democratic trend. You saw
Mm.
that with your AOCs and your Bernie Sanders, right? Who are like, I mean, Sanders consistently, every time he's asked, about being a socialist, he would say, well, no, 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 not like Cuba, like Denmark,
Yeah.
like the Nordic models, right? And what he's
Yeah.
doing consistently is he's differentiating between the Nordic model and Cuba, which I think is right, is correct, right? The Nordic model is a capitalist model, and the Nordic model actually, the way that they can afford to grant citizens so many rights and good wages and a lot of public services is through their imperialism, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and so it makes sense that Bernie Sanders is not an anti-imperialist because his entire capitalist model actually is contingent on the pillaging of the global South. And so I think
hmm
you have all of these sort of baby leftists, these SOCDEMs in particular, coming out of places like the US, who are like they're upset that the United States is not sharing its wealth with its citizens, right? They're upset that Bezos is rich, but they're not asking the questions of like, why is America wealthy? Well, America is wealthy because Iraq is poor, or America is wealthy because
Yeah.
Libya is poor. Like, they don't care why America is wealthy. And if they could have a little bit more of a cut, right? If they could just have some healthcare and some social
Yes.
services, they would be happy, And I think that that's sort of one of the biggest mistakes that we can make, I think, is allowing us to characterize those folks as really being like on the left, right? Because I think those are
Hmm.
people who are still committed to the capitalist project, right? And so I think the left has to begin at anti-capitalism, and it has to
At
begin
the bare minimum,
anti-imperialism.
please. At the bare
Yes.
minimum.
And
Honestly,
anti-imperialism, yeah.
honestly, and I think I don't know what it is, and this is not to I don't want to name and shame people, but I think there needs to be a when we say certain phrases, we need to think of its logical conclusion. What I mean by that is, if we say Black Lives Matter in the US, in Canada, in the UK, a lot of it sounds like Black Lives Matter where I am right now, as opposed to
Mhm.
globally. And why I say that is because Black Lives Matter, but then you celebrate iPhone bringing out a case or bringing out some kind of celebratory, culturalist turn on black culture, when iPhone's whole project depends on the mining of cobalt from child labor in Congo, for example.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? So I'm talking like, is it Black Lives Matter? When I say Black Lives Matter, and I should hope everyone means it globally.
Mhm.
And so yeah, so if someone was to ask you, why do you think it's important then we have to be anti-imperialist? What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think right, it's like an absolute bare minimum. I think like Evo Morales sort of said, like it doesn't matter if you call yourself progressive, if you're not anti-imperialist, you're not actually progressive, right? And
Yep.
I think when you're like, especially when you're like, situated in like the belly of the beast, right? You're in the imperial core. The
Mhm.
anti-imperialist position is so critical because otherwise you cannot be in solidarity and in joint struggle with people from the global south, right? I mean, I always think to this piece by Huey Newton where he sent a letter to the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, and he
Mhm.
in that letter he's offering to assist the troops of the National Liberation Front in their fight against American imperialism by actually sending troops. So, the Panthers sent troops over to fight against
Wow.
American empire, right? And, in that letter, he says that the Black Panther Party gives up all of its claims to nationalism because the United States, he says, is not a nation, but an empire, right? And he talks about
Mm.
the way in which the US has sort of pillaged the global South and, all of these things. And he contrasts that with the nationhood of the global South, where he says they're the global South, the exploited people and countries, they're fighting for nationalism because they're fighting for self-determination and this a place where they can actually protect themselves from imperialism, right? And so I
Mhm.
think there's like this Western chauvinism, right, that we see so frequently on in the left of the imperial core. And it manifests in all these different ways. One of the ways that it manifests is, of course, like, the social democratic kind of trend that we were discussing. But another way that it manifests is through like this equation of all nationalism, right, as being the same. So like the nationalism of
Yes.
the US is the same as the nationalism of Cuba. Therefore, the police of the US equal are the same as the police of Cuba. And I saw these kinds of takes coming out, right, where like there was no distinction between the Cuban state, which is, a socialist state, an imperfect
Yep.
socialist state, sure, but a state that has been very clear that it is working towards socialism and that has
Yeah.
been like really fighting this huge bully just north of its waters, and people were equating that to the American state. And I think there needs to be an understanding of how the nationalism of the oppressed is very different than the nationalism of the oppressor. And we need, like, that is such an important piece for us to be able to extend solidarity and to see ourselves as being, internationalists in this struggle against imperialism and colonialism and capitalism. And I think without that, we are going to be in a position continuously where the left in the imperial core is trying to distance itself from the left of the global South and is going to fail
Absolutely.
at being able to build international solidarity.
Thank you for that. I think that's a very important intervention because what we're essentially saying that all nationalism isn't the same. I mean, the nationalism of those who stormed the Capitol or Trump supporters or those in the imperial core is completely different to self-determination projects on the continent, for example, or in the Middle East and places like that.
Mm-hmm.
Very important intervention. So let's talk about some things you might hear, and a lot of the time we hear China is imperialist. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that brings us back to that like really important piece on what is imperialism, right? And so if we accept that China is socialist, and I would argue
Yep.
that China is socialist. I mean, I think that there are clearly capitalist penetrations, but that it's ultimately still a socialist country. Then it
Yeah.
cannot be imperialist in the way that we understand imperialism via Lenin's framework. And so that kind of brings me back to that really important piece. I think China has one military base, and so just to like put that
Yeah.
all into context, right? This idea that China is imperialist, I think, is actually coming especially from like a lot of Western anxiety about China. We see sort of the way in which the anti-China rhetoric has really dominated American foreign policy. I mean, when Biden stepped into office, or I think it was at the confirmation of Blinken, Blinken commended Trump's policy on China. He said Trump had it
Wow.
right on China. And so you see like this pivot that has been happening for the past little while, slowly from the Middle East, focused on China specifically. And I think it's really important that we understand that a lot of the sort of fear mongering, particularly about China, the Orientalism, right, the way in which there's like this culture of fear, that, I mean, we even saw that with COVID-19 and sort of the way in which it's been either called intentionally, the Chinese virus and things like that,
Yeah.
or
Or the Kung
even
flu.
exactly, or even some of the conspiracy theories around like the originate, like where the virus originated,
Yeah.
which are now being perpetuated by the Biden administration, right? Which I think, just to make like a really little quip here, is that it's interesting, people like to pretend that the US is like this two-party state, that there's like this healthy
Yep.
democracy in the US. But when you look at, Trump's China policy and Biden's China policy, you actually don't really see a difference at all, right? And arguably Biden's
Yep.
policy is going to become more hawkish as time goes on. And so, I think that that's why those definitions of imperialism are really important. But also, I
Yep.
think that, it's China such a wonderful example of how the United States is not actually a democracy, but it's just this like one, it really is just one, it's a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. I think that's the best way to sort of describe it. It
Hundred
is a
percent.
dictatorship.
You know what's so funny about that? People a lot of the time will talk to me, and sometimes in good faith, sometimes more often than not, in bad faith, will engage on my platforms and be like, "Oh, Cuba is dictatorship. It's a one-party system." And I'm like, "Oh, do you know that almost 80% of the population voted for constitutional reforms 2 years ago? Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
you don't get 80% of the population in the US voting in elections." Then I said, then they say things like, "Oh, China one-party system." I said, "Yes, one party, but there's obviously debate within that party of how to do things." And I said, ironically, you people are talking from the perspective of living in America. Let's be honest. I mean, for me, for all intents and purposes, America is a one-party system. Definitely when it comes to foreign policy.
Yeah.
Foreign policy is one party. Maybe, I mean, yes, okay, internally, the domestic policies may differ a little bit. It may differ on when it comes to welfare, when it comes to certain investments, ideological underpinnings of how we redistribute wealth internally might have a slight difference, but for all intents and purposes, it's a duopoly, and definitely on the foreign policy level, it's a one party state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's so interesting when we talk about like something like democracy, right? And we don't, I mean, like we saw this, right, coming from the American left in particular, but also like the Canadian left, and I think like more broadly the Western left, right? This idea of
Yeah.
Cuba as a dictatorship, right? And we don't often like unpack the way in which like democracy is something that we understand and construct in direct like juxtaposition to regimes, right? Or
Hmm.
dictatorships, right? And so much of that is rooted in like Western exceptionalism and chauvinism, right? And so, who gets described as democratic and who gets described as authoritarian or dictatorial? Who gets called a regime and who gets called a government? I think I wish I could remember which news source it was in, but they called the Batista regime a government and Castro's government a regime, right? In the same sentence. And so, like
Wow.
you said, Cuba has this really healthy democratic process with local elections that involve youth and community members. They don't allow any kind of corporate donations for elections, right? And
Yep.
you contrast that with the US, which, like we said, is like this dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Or you could contrast that with Germany, which has had since the year 2005 one head of state. So in that
Exactly.
time, Cuba has had three heads of state. And so there's like this really strange kind of juxtaposition between dictatorships and democracies that is like extremely rooted in Western exceptional or American exceptionalism, especially. And
Exactly.
one other thing that I've really been sitting with and unpacking a lot lately, right, is the discourse on Cuba and democracy. So when we say that the United States, when the United States says we want to bring democracy to, insert country name, we as the
Yep.
left really can quickly understand that, okay, well, that's just code for imperialism. Like we saw the way that
Yep.
that manifested in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and others. And so what's remarkable, though, is that Western leftists have literally adopted the same discourse, of these countries being undemocratic and needing democracy. And so while they pose their position as being very distinct from imperialism, and oftentimes they cloak it in the language of nuance of, well,
Hmm.
Cubans want democracy, but yes, we also need to lift the embargo, right? They're still ultimately like asserting this Western idea that country X needs democracy. And what it
Yep.
does is it ultimately manufactures consent for the state and imperialists to do their work of spreading that, quote unquote democracy.
Absolutely. A slight shift. And I mean, I didn't actually intend to speak about this, but something that kind of bugged me, and maybe you can speak to this further and feel free to correct me or come push back about what I'm about to say. But I saw many people who were pro Syrian protesting against Assad, obviously. And just for full disclosure, and I think people have criticized me actually in support of the protesters in Syria. But then when the people quote unquote protesting, and I call it in air bubbles right now, air quotes right now, protesting in Cuba, people were saying, oh, the same people who are anti-Assad were saying, listen to the protesters in Cuba. We have to listen to the protesters. And I don't know, I was a bit shocked. I was thinking, I don't know if there's kind of exporting of a blueprint from one country to another doesn't always fit quite well to me. The circumstances of Syria are much different, are very different to circumstances in Cuba. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there's also like there's this refusal to understand that, like, okay, so I think this actually stems from this like homogenization of the global south in this really
Hmm.
strange way that denies them the analysis of class relations or diversity of political opinions. So I know we saw that a lot with Cuba when they were saying, well, center Cuban voices, and like the
Yes.
Cuban voices they were talking about were Miami Cubans, right?
Yep.
And so, but like we never say that when it comes to the United States. So we don't say like listen to American voices because we understand that, like, on January 6th, right? I mean, it would have been absurd for a media outlet to say we need to center American voices, because you would
Yep.
understand that there's a segment of the United States that's part of this insurrection that has a particular political opinion. And we understood that insurrection was not progressive, right? So we understand in the US, right, that not all protests, not all actions are progressive, and that some are reactionary. And I think
Yep.
because we hold this chauvinism of the global south, which relegates it, but especially socialist or anti-imperialist countries, as being like inherently reactionary, or like countries that are lacking progress, we see any kind of movement, any kind of gathering of people to protest in the global
Yes.
south as being progressive, even when they're reactionary, because we've relegated to the global south to like this reactionary entity, right? And so,
Hmm.
I think that's a huge piece of the conversation that still hasn't really been discussed amongst like huge elements of the left, is like, how can we interrogate how we understand the global South? Why are we so hell-bent on these sort of depictions of the global South as being this like reactionary place, to the point where any sort of protest that happens in the global South, we immediately assume that that is something of progress?
Yes. I really think we're kind of beguiled or, made confused by the aesthetic of protest, isn't it? As if to say any protest or any uprising or any kind of demonstration is somehow a synthesis or representation of the will of the people, no matter
Mm-hmm.
where it occurs. And
Mm-hmm.
I find it very strange. And again, you make the very important intervention. We recognize it when we see it in our own countries, but somehow when we see it in the global South taking place, it's like, oh no, we have to listen to people. I'm thinking, yeah, but okay. I mean, this is it might get me in trouble, but do I care? The kind of recurring tweet I'm sure you've seen is, "This is why Castro put your granddaddy in the blender."
Yes.
Because for me, it's true. And I think, I don't know, what do you think? I mean, full disclosure again, those who know me, I called my account the last week a stan account of Castro, and I recognize it an imperfect human being. But I said, I think it takes again from the left of Castro. I thought, you know what? There's definitely people from the leftist figures in communist experiments who, for want of a better word, are problematic.
Mhm.
In
Yeah.
terms of like, in terms of how we assess them. And even if we look at the leftist leaders amongst themselves, we know Castro had some issues with Mao, for example, and the Sino-US, Sino split, and
Mhm.
whatever. We can talk about this, and we talk about where Mao fell short and where Mao did great. Lenin, who I'm a fan of, but obviously other figures as well who are quote unquote problematic. But when I thought, I don't know, I kind of felt, maybe let me know what you think. I felt Castro was an easy one to be on the side of.
Mhm. I agree. No, you know what? I completely agree. And actually, just a really quick note that I think this is Newton that has this incredible sort of piece on like revolutionary critique and reactionary critique, right? So there's
Yeah.
always room for revolutionary critique of revolutionary figures and parties in a way that helps us progress the goals of the left. But then reactionary critique is not something that we should be holding space for. But
Yes.
I completely agree. But I thought that Cuba was the easiest. I mean, Cuba's the easiest project to defend, frankly, right? I mean, when
Yes.
you look at sort of the accomplishments of Cuba, when you look at its healthcare, when you look at the fact that they've essentially, near eradicated houselessness, and when you look at Cuba's role in the world, right? Like they sent fighters to fight against South African
Oh,
apartheid.
yep.
They've supported Palestine consistently. I mean, Cuba has played this like incredible revolutionary role. And so I thought it was really scary to see Western leftists failing on the question of Cuba. And it gave me so much anxiety thinking about like, what does it mean for the future when we're going to, likely only see heightened aggression towards, say, for
Yep.
example, Iran, where there's not only like a lack of socialism in Iran, but also there's this high degree of Islamophobia in the West. And so how much will the Western left fail in combating
Yep.
imperialism against Iran when they couldn't get it right even on this socialist project of Cuba? Or even I'm thinking to like the anti-imperialist position on Libya. Like, I mean, that was a
Yep.
really, really lonely time for anti-imperialists because so much of the Western left just fixated on Gaddafi, and they drew from these really Orientalist depictions of Gaddafi and, of people of the global South, and particularly Libyans, as being unable to govern, right? A lot of that kind of falls into the Orientalism that we see on the question
Yep.
of dictatorships. And it really quickly manufactured American consent for the destruction of Libya, right? And so, that's why anti-imperialism is like the minimum, because we're supposed to be anti-imperialist regardless of who we're dealing with or whether the country in question is what some might call, actually existing socialism. And so
Yep.
when you can't even get it right on this tiny island that the US has been starving for 60 years, that has,
Yep.
despite that, managed to have all these wonderful accomplishments, it's a scary time to think about what that's going to look
Honestly.
like. Mm-hmm.
No, honestly, I was proper confused because I thought to myself, wait a minute. Again, I recognize the problematic figures historically, and I think thank you for mentioning the revolutionary critique aspect. But I thought for me, Castro is such an easy one to defend. I mean, this is a man who I mean, there wasn't an anti-imperial struggle or anti-colonial struggle that took place on the continent that Castro didn't support almost at every turn, almost at every turn. So I kind of thought, yeah, it was a bit of a scary one seeing the reactions. I mean, before we started today, you mentioned that you have like an interest in Syria. What do you think about the charge? And I think I don't agree with this charge, but if you, and I know where you're gonna, I think I can kind of almost preempt where they're gonna go. But people say if you don't support Western intervention, this is people on the left, by the way. If you don't support Western intervention in Syria, you're somehow an Assadist or pro-Assad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's so interesting how like the term Assadist has sort of become like this insult, right? And nobody wants to be called an Assadist, so you're like tiptoeing. People are trying to avoid the conversation of Syria, right? And I think like ultimately, right, the way that I see it, I mean, at this point, I've been called an Assadist, I've been called a tanky, right? I've been called all of these things, and I'm like, well, okay, but hold up, like Assad in particular, the Assad family from the father to Bashar have been historically very, anti-communist, right? They have been
Yeah,
sort of not there. They have never really been friends of the Syrian left. It's actually why the Syrian left is so weak. And Assad's father historically was not anti-imperialist. I mean, I'm Lebanese and Palestinian, and so my
yeah,
family understands the role that Hafiz played in the Lebanese civil war as not a progressive figure. And so, as somebody who has a lot of, I think, important critiques of Assad, right, it's quite frustrating because I don't understand, how having an anti-imperialist stance and saying what's happening in Syria is an imperialist aggression, right? This has
yeah,
been for many years this major imperialist aggression. We've had the funneling of weapons from Israel and via Turkey and all these places to destabilize Syria, I mean, we're just calling that what it is, right? And you cannot sit in the middle of imperialism. You can't say, well, I'm against imperialism and against Assad, so I'm going to stay completely quiet on Syria. Well, right now in Syria, the primary contradiction is imperialism, right?
mm,
Much of what's happened in Syria has become sort of this reactionary imperialist movement, even though that's not really how it began. And so we have to deal with the material realities of what's happening on the ground. And we also have to like be, brutally honest about what does imperialism look like and what will it mean for Syria if Syria falls to the imperialists, right? And I think,
mm,
Iraq is a really great example and a heartbreaking one because actually in the case of Iraq, it was very similar. The American left, I mean, you had the small mobilization of people who were against the war, but I do think that you had a lot of folks on the left sort of fixated on Saddam, right? Really, really fixated
yes,
on Saddam. And, what we see now, right, in Iraq, and I think, actually Nkrumah's analysis is really helpful here. So what you see in Iraq now with the extreme U.S. involvement in government is the extreme, U.S. involvement in the government and internal security agencies. So, now if the U.S. pulls out of Iraq, let's say tomorrow, we have the question, well, would Iraq be independent, right? So like via the imperialist aggression on Iraq, there was like the full restructuring of Iraq's economy. There was the allowing of full foreign ownership of Iraqi state-owned assets. So about 200 state-owned enterprises, including electricity, telecommunications, and pharmaceutical industries, were completely dismantled. Iraqi
hmm
banks, mines, factories, they've all been shifted into foreign corporate ownerships. And most of them have moved their assets entirely out of Iraq. And so what was marketed sort of as this war against this barbaric dictatorial regime and, this idea that the US was spreading, quote unquote democracy, aka capitalism, was this imperialist aggression for mass profits for any corporations able to enter, formerly state-owned Iraqi sectors. And it's resulted in these huge profits for military,
mm,
security, and arms-related industries. And so like we need to learn from the lessons of the past and the present, right? I mean, Iraq is still in this crisis. I mean, this isn't even something of the past. And we need to be honest about what would happen if the Syrian government fell tomorrow to these American and imperialist backed rebel groups, right? I mean, the days of there being sort of this independent rebel group of people who are upset at the government are now over. You don't really have that in Syria anymore. These
Okay.
major factions have really taken over, and they're fully funded by imperialists. And so, we have to be honest about what would happen if the government fell. And that doesn't mean that that position says that we support Assad and we want that government to stay in power forever, but rather we understand that it will be that much harder for any kind of progressive movement to ever win under a a fallen sort of Syrian government, right? Like, I mean, we see Libya right now, we see Iraq right now, we see the conditions of what could have been left in those countries doesn't exist anymore. So we have to be honest about the situation, and we have to learn from history and understand that anti-imperialism, is so important, and it's all that we can do as people living in the imperial core. I mean, I could sit all day and critique Bashar al-Assad from my comfortable home, right? It's not going to change anything. But when we mobilize mass movements against imperialism in Syria, we could potentially change something which could eventually embolden an actual leftist movement in Syria.
Okay, so what you're essentially saying is, so would you say the dynamic or the what's the word? The movement which started the initial uprising has completely changed then in Syria for what it is today.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, regretfully, it really has. I mean, I would say the best way to sort of characterize it is the Syrian sort of revolution. The Syrian revolution was completely hijacked by imperialists.
Wow. And I think again, it's about being brutally honest, isn't it? I mean, a lot of
Hmm.
people find it very difficult to have these conversations, but I think these conversations need to be had. And I think just to kind of end, I'm not sure if you've seen it, but if you haven't, I recommend it, and I recommend all of my listeners. South of the Border, Oliver Stone's documentary in which he speaks about how Chavez got to power. If you want, I know some people like reading, some people like listening. If you like watching, that documentary details how America is as an imperial state and what is imperialism and what imperialism means for the material conditions of people in these countries. And if you, after watching that, you don't adopt an anti-imperialist take or posturing, I don't know what will do it. Also, as
Hmm.
well, another book you can't kind of miss is How Europe Underdeveloped Africa
Yeah,
by Walter Rodney as well. I think
yeah.
these are key kind of takes and sorry, key kind of texts or things to listen to or watch. Thank you so much, Yara. This has been an awesome conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Hope it's been okay for you. People, please hit up Yara on socials. I know she's on Clubhouse a lot as well. If you want to speak to her further, I'm not sure if she will reply, but if she does, she's a great resource to have. Thank you so much once again. And thanks for being on the Malcolm Effect. Please like, comment, subscribe, be that on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. And until next time, take care.